Hi, my name is Jeremy. This is Red Beans Recording, and this is the setup that I just used to perform a set for the Lo-Fi Festival, which was a 3-day streaming festival online with a bunch of really talented artists. It was my first live set, sort of, especially as Red Beans Recording, and it was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot while preparing for it and also performing, and I wanted to talk a little bit about how it was done, especially focusing on the Deluge for live performance. Before we talk about the Deluge, I want to talk about sort of the more technical aspects of the setup because I think people are curious about that, and that includes the camera and tripod, which I'm showing you a video of now. It's a Sony a7 III. I have an Atomos recorder that's receiving HDMI from the Sony, and that's my main recorder. That's what records all the videos. And then an HDMI out of that goes into the A10 Mini by Blackmagic. This is sort of like a little streaming box. It accepts HDMI inputs, I think up to 4, outputs video via USB into your computer, which OBS, the streaming software that I use begrudgingly. And to its credit, this thing works perfectly. It lets me use my nice camera as opposed to a web camera, and it works flawlessly. There's basically no latency between it and the audio interface. So I used to use a Zoom here, this handy H6, which is a great tool. I would send inputs into it from whatever synth I was using, and then using the line out, I would go into the microphone input of this thing and record lossless on the H6, and then send that audio as an audio device via the Blackmagic A10 Mini into OBS. The issue with that was there was some gain staging issues or volume issues between what this needed to get a clean signal and what this needed to get a clean signal. So I recently got the Arturia Audio Fuse Studio, which you can kind of see over here. It's an audio interface, and one of the cool features that it has is a digital loopback. And that means internally that you can send any of your signals, including your DAW or your external signals like these things, into a feed that OBS will be able to pick up and like say, oh, I can grab the audio from that. If anyone is familiar with OBS, it's notoriously bad at recognizing things that have multiple inputs and outputs, like audio interfaces. So I was very pleasantly surprised to find out that that worked perfectly, and I was able to record my set in Adobe Audition as WAV files, and also send that output to OBS, and these things synced fine. There was no latency, and that was beautiful. So that's the technical stuff. We'll talk about the iPad in a bit. Let's talk about what the Elektron Analog Heat Mark II is doing. The Elektron Analog Heat Mark II is a analog distortion device, basically, but it can do a lot more than that, and I have a video about it you can watch right here that goes into it very deeply. In this case, I'm using this as a clean compressor. So I'm on clean boost over here. The drive is set all the way up. The wet level is set all the way up, and the dry wet mix is set to 100% wet. I have a high pass filter over here, which means that it's shelving off some of those bass notes, but this is set really low. This is set to like 20 hertz, which is kind of the bottom of human hearing. And then I have the resonance turned up just a tiny bit, which basically cleans up everything below 20 hertz, which is kind of pointless, but it also adds a very little tiny bump down there in the subs to just kind of give it a little bit more character. I'm using the low and high EQ almost as a smile curve, which is meaning that if your lows are down here and your highs are up here, I'm getting a little bit of processing like this, which just gives a little bit of interest and color. And then the most important thing this is doing is acting as a compressor. One of the cool things that this has on it is an envelope follower, and if I hit play here, you'll see what's going on. So you can see here that this signal is now bouncing up and down. It is getting an input from the signal, and it's recognizing the peaks and valleys of the audio signal that's coming in. I have my attack and release set to 0 attack, so very fast, and my release pretty fast release, but still not super long. If I go over to the envelope page 2, I can set this to modulate something. In this case, I have it modulating the wet level, which is the overall wet volume of the analog heat's output. This depth thing is set to a negative amount. So I'm going to turn this all the way down. You can hear, that's what an over-compressed sound sounds like. That's way too compressed. But if I turn this up to like negative 20 something, the analog heat is now catching some peaks and valleys and just doing a little bit of dynamics processing to my signal, kind of gelling it together, which is just wonderful. If I turn this up, it acts as an expander, which is actually pretty fucking cool too. but I was using it as a compressor, coloration, EQ. Finally, before we talk about the Deluge, when you're streaming, doing a concert, please have hydration and maybe a little snack. Trail mix. This is for all those people who say, I smack my lips too much during these videos. I'd love for you to like talk on microphone and see if you have zero vocal tics or anything. Let's see if that works for you. All right, we're finally in a position to talk about the Deluge. So when you think about live performance from a performer perspective, you kind of have to think about how much control and how much prep you want to do for the live set. So if you think of a band, each member of the band is playing an instrument in real time. Every single note that they make is in real time. The decisions they make is in real time. And the arrangement follows that. They have something in their brain as a blueprint for the song, and they still have to make it happen in real time. So that's one type of live performance that you can do with the Deluge, where everything is sort of like set up as a sound and you play it all in real time, probably like finger drumming or something like that. I didn't do any of that. The next kind I can think of is where you have some pre-made content, but the arrangement is up in the air. And I did a lot of that. So that's the first thing we're going to talk about. This is the track that I opened the set with. And it was a nice little way to get into things where I could perform, but it wasn't too high stakes. So a little bit about the Deluge. I'm in song mode right now for the Deluge, which means each one of these tracks here represents a clip that I've made with musical information on it. For instance, here, that's the drums. I have a top drum, sort of a sub hit, an actual sub bass line, and then variations on the samples. So I choose whether or not I want something to play, and there's a couple ways to do that. You saw me hitting shift and turning this from green to red and back and forth. Red means off, green means on, and I can do this in real time. The other way that the Deluge lets you turn clips on and off is sort of like an Ableton clip launcher. So check this out. You can see that it's turning on and off in time. Both are very, very useful, depending on what kind of music you're making. So I can turn sections on and off. A quick note about groups. Whenever you make a track on the Deluge, it gets assigned a color over here. These colors represent sort of like groups that you can all launch together. So think of them as sections almost, and you can change by holding shift what each one of these would be. So if I make these all yellow and I make these all blue, if I hit this, it's going to turn all the yellow tracks on. If I hit this, it's going to turn all the blue tracks on. But it's going to turn the other tracks off. That may or may not be useful to you. I don't generally use these, but I did in this particular case. When you make a copy of a track in the Deluge, so here's my effect track up here. If I hold it down and press up here, it's going to make a new track, and it's going to assign it a different group color. So it assigned it yellow. The Deluge is smart. If I make a copy of a track that I'm going to make a variation on, it's probably not meant to play when the original version of that clip is playing. So it auto-assigns it a new group, and you can go through and make, obviously, those decisions yourself by changing group colors here. But the way that this expresses itself in this particular track is these harp lines here have different variations on the bass line. So this bass line here and this harp line go together. This harp variation and this bass line go together, so if I press these two, it's going to stop the other two. And that same thing goes for down here as well. So even if you're not using full sections with these color-coded things, you can make decisions about choking other clips or stopping other clips when certain clips play, and that's very useful for bigger changes in your song. Finally, we have down here this rainbow track. This is a keyboard track. If I turn this off, the keyboard, and go back into song mode, that track's now blank. I like to set this solo track to keyboard mode so I can automatically find it and know that this is where I can play something. want to change something, you have to go back into song mode and change it real quick. So I was in track mode when I was playing that, and the two views are distinct. So that's the basics of this particular type of performance, where you have clips that you can launch either in real time by holding Shift and turning them on and off, or by telling the Deluge that you want it to launch on the next round. Let's go on to the next type of thing that I did with the Deluge for this performance. This is another track from the performance. And what we're looking at here, you can see song mode is blinking. This is Arranger mode in the Deluge. This was an addition via a firmware a while ago. It was very cool. And what you're looking at here, you can see the bar number moving here. This is a linear left to right iteration of the song. So it will play from left to right like a DAW. And each one of these is still a track like we had in song mode, like this. But you can choose to place them in whatever places you want. And if I zoom in a little bit, let's see, to fourth, which would be a quarter note, you can see they have a little tail. This one has a longer tail. That's because each one of these clips is a certain length. And you can choose to cut that clip off a little bit if you want. See how I can change the tail here, like that. Tails are important. So you can build a track like this from left to right, and when I hit play, it'll play the whole song. I could technically hit play on this and walk away and not do anything, but that's not very fun. So while I wanted to construct a more complex song in this to play for people, I also still want to have control over some stuff. And that's where we have the iPad. So let me talk about the iPad real quick. When I was prepping for this set, I went through and first made a sheet of all the tracks and how long they were, because I knew I had an hour-long set, just to kind of get an idea of, what I was dealing with. Then I made a page for each track. And what I have up here is the BPM, and I have each track from top to bottom with its color coding. So vocal, kick, beat, open, hi-hat, snare. You can move tracks around on this by holding it down and moving up and down. So one of the things I did was rearrange these so like all the beats were at the top, effects are usually at the bottom, and then I just try to make sense of it so that in the heat of things I can look at this really quick and know exactly where I might want to reach for something to have an effect on the performance. I'll talk about why I had the BPM in the thing in the next one, because it's a bit of a pitfall, but not a deal breaker. So within the context of this particular type of performance, the Arranger mode performance, I can click on one of these tracks here and hold it down and get access to these performance controls up here. These performance controls have access to a lot of the things that you might generally want to mess with, like volume pan, cutoff, resonance, attack release, delay time and delay amount, sidechain reverb, mod rate, depth, stutter, and then custom 1, custom 2, and custom 3. Custom 2 and 3 are set to like a bit crusher and decimator, which is kind of nice to add some grunge to things. Custom 1 is the devil because it's set to pitch, and when you're using stems, like I'll show you in a bit, if you accidentally tap that, you will fuck up your entire performance like I did with the last track of my set. Here's the vocal up here, and I'm going to show you kind of what I can do with these performance controls. Nothing's gonna change, nothing's gonna change, I can change the cutoff frequency, bring something in, I can chop it, and I can add delays and stuff. For some reason that just turned off. We'll go right here. So all those controls are available to every single one of these tracks here, and depending on how you use them, they can be useful or not. So for instance, over here, I think it's blue, quick pad under orange, so that's bass, and this is my quick pad. If I hold this down in Arranger mode and hit play, I'll be able to play from this time right here. So one of the things I like to do was stutter this pad right here as it came in the drop. So that was stutter in combination with a little bit of the delay. The delay is very musical. A mount here adds like a feedback effect too. It's not just mix, it's also feedback. So you have to be careful with it because while you can get really cool effects, it can blow your entire dynamic range out of context and just overwhelm your entire mix if you're not careful. So each one of these has performance controls. I can affect things like volume. So like, for instance, this is my kick snare in the break. If I wanted to change that aspect of the arrangement, I could. Could add reverb. And then bring it back in. So while I have this set arrangement, I can make decisions about how I might want to turn things on and off throughout. And I can also affect the performance controls. Hitting Shift over here will turn tracks on and off. That's also very useful for, let's say just carving something out of your arrangement if you want to change a breakdown, if you want to get rid of part of a beat, something like that. The other useful thing about these things is if for some reason your mix sounds weird on a particular system you're working on, if you haven't had a chance to do a sound check, you can instantly find the track, turn down the volume of it to a more appropriate level. Or for instance, hit cutoff and go over to your EQ and turn your highs or lows down or something like that. Using the iPad and using the structure, I'm able to look over here and have sort of instant recall of what I'm doing, make performance decisions, and have fun, which I think is the most important thing. Let's go on to the third type of performance that I did with this, and that was stem performance. So I'm loading up Halo here. We're in song mode again, not arranger mode. So each one of these is a track. All of these are long. They don't have really much information on them compared to, let's say, this top track, which is a kit. And that's because each one of these things here is a stem, meaning that I went into Ableton and I took some of my old tracks and I grouped like instruments. So like all the drums, the bass instruments, the guitar, something like that. And I exported each one of those as a stem at 44:116 stereo wave files. And I wasn't sure if the Deluge was going to be able to handle this, but it can actually play stems back en masse. So there are 8 tracks here, I think. And each one is a stem. If I go into, this is a kit. Here's the samples thing. And if I show the waveform, this is the entire track here. All of the samples were grouped into this thing. And there's probably even silence in here and stuff like that. But I just dropped each one in and the whole arrangement is now in song mode. But I don't have any control over it. In the way that I had control over the individual clips in song mode when we were looking at the first track. So I can't relaunch these in time or anything because their time is the entire track. Does that make sense? With the exception of this friend up here. So each one of these tracks got an auxiliary drum track, at least one, and maybe even a bass track sometimes. So this track up here is sort of an extra drum, and that doubles both as sort of a extra oomph, but also this kick down here is triggering the Deluge's sidechain. So if I want one of these tracks to sort of pump against the mix, I can use that kick as the signal. So you just heard the drums come in. I can still turn these on and off. So I can still have an effect over the arrangement by muting things, which is cool. I can make decisions on the fly about whether or not I want to have the drums or the bass come down more in a part of an arrangement like I did with this one. I can have each one of these tracks have a little bit more processing on it than it did in Ableton. So I have access to things like, for each one of these, the cutoff frequency, the low pass cutoff frequency. I also have access to a 2-band EQ, so I can turn highs and lows, whatever I want to do. I still have control over things, and I can still do those performance things that I talked about earlier by pressing down a key and then accessing all of these performance controls up here. So you saw me doing that a lot during the performance. I was going through and adjusting delay amounts and stutters and stuff like that for each one of these individual tracks, turning things on and off. And it was still fun. It still felt like I was interacting with it, even though I was really just interacting with stems. Now is a good time to mention why I have the BPM listed up here in the iPad thing. Something I noticed with the stem approach here is that there's a bit of a disagreement between the clock in Ableton, the tempo clock, and the tempo clock in the Deluge. So there is a chance as you've gotten into like maybe the third, second, fourth minute of your song that you're going to hear things drifting a little bit. I found generally that I needed to slow down the Deluge for half a second, almost like bumping a record when you're beat matching and DJing, to get any tracks that I had made using the Deluge's clock, like this drum track up here, to match up with these stems, which all came from Ableton. So I can just kind of go like this real quick, push the tempo down, nudge it down to like 109, come back and listen and resync my beats to everything. So I don't need to talk too much about this because you've already seen all the techniques that I used for this, but I will say that the biggest pitfall that I had with this particular type of mixing and this particular type of performance was custom 1 right here, this custom performance mode. Let's go ahead and show how I fucked up. Okay, so now my stem drum is in and I have my Deluge drum. We'll wait for it to actually come in. So at some point during the performance, I was holding this down and accessing these performance controls. I went over to stutter to have some fun, and I accidentally knocked this knob right here. This knob is the pitch for the entire track. You can see it says affect entire track. If you knock this at all when you're dealing with something that goes the entire length of your track that as a stem, you're fucked. Like you have just knocked that track out of time probably completely for the entire track, unless you can like rush and somehow get it back to where it's supposed to be. But in the heat of things, the last thing that people want to do is listen to you try to recover this fucked thing here and just be out of time and, you know, blah, blah, blah. You're ignoring the rest of your performance. So I had to mute this track. And I still had all this stuff going, and it was like right in the big part of the track. This was actually happening with Last of Summer, not this particular track. So let me load that up and I'll show you what I did. Which was really just meant to be help to these drums. These drums here with the stem from Ableton have all the real good stuff on it, like the fills, all the high end, blah, blah, blah. So I accidentally knocked this out of time by hitting this pitch thing here, which I'm going to reassign as soon as I figure out how. And I had to mute this track. And I was stuck with this little tiny drum thing that was turned down, just supposed to be support. And I'm like, fuck, okay, well, what do I do? So I clicked into it. I said affect entire track. I turned it up. I went to a blank part of the kit. I hit load. And I tried to find a hi-hat, which took me a bit. And then I had to make a pattern and pray to God that it worked. I was lucky that I had loaded a hi-hat that didn't sound like shit, like this one does. You know, I'm not really happy with that either, but it helped. I was lucky enough, again, to load a hi-hat that actually kind of worked in the context. So I had to turn the drum loop up. I had to sort of like bolster it to take up the space that the messed up drum track took in the track that I had muted. And I had a pretty obvious like tempo flub leading up to that. So a little frustrating, but lesson learned. And I will nuke custom 1 from the map or assign it to something that's a lot less harmful in this context. And that's the lesson I learned from that. So that's a walkthrough of how I performed with the Synthstrom Deluge for the Lo-Fi Festival. I hope this was informative. If you have more questions about the Deluge, feel free to ask. I actually have some banked videos where I am making some of the beats that I performed in there from scratch. So I'll try to release the like the deep house one that people seem to really like. Maybe this week. I'm not really sure. Probably this week. Hey, I'm unemployed. I can just put videos out now. That leads me to the final part. If you found this video helpful, feel free to give it a like, thumbs up, whatever the hell they're calling it these days. I have a Patreon if you'd like to support me to see more content like this, and you'll get perks like I think I'm going to put this set up there for patrons to listen to. I don't have a job. This is my job now. Red means recording. My name is Jeremy. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks for watching.